Well, good afternoon. I'm going to take this in a different direction. And the last conversation, I think, teed it up very nicely. I often begin this conversation with the disclaimer that we can get a little preachy, and in St. Albans we feel like we've figured out how small communities can chart their own course economically, and we feel like we've been to the mountaintop, so to speak. But usually we're not delivering it from a pulpit. So we'll see how this goes, and Seth already put me on a short leash with this cord here. St. Albans had engaged in many of these same strategies for decades. My favorite document dates from the mid-1980s, and it talks about redevelopment strategies for downtown St. Albans. And when I arrived as city manager 15 years ago, 30 years later, very little of those ideas had changed. They were all still great ideas, but none of them had moved. And St. Albans developed a model of economic development based on market principles. We still plan, we still regulate, but that's good at stopping projects, in my experience, or allowing you to get what the market will provide. But it's not good at helping bring your visions and your community dreams to life. But we have those tools as municipalities. Let's go to the next slide, John. This is the team that did it in St. Albans. This is the city council, 2 mayors, and our downtown organization, and maybe most importantly, the president of the local bank. And about 7 or 8 years ago, they had really had enough, and they were ready to chart a new course in the city, and there were some environmental and political factors that led to that. But that created an environment where they wanted our political leaders to take more risks. Some of that grew out of crisis. You can't manufacture that, but you can't waste it. Those are things that aren't typically associated with Vermont local governance. We're typically risk averse. We typically don't like to put our skin in the game, and we typically like to hold on to money as long as possible. But you're leaving your best players off the field when you do that. And we figured this out through trial and error. So what I'd like to talk about is half a dozen different real estate deals, talk about the city's role in those, and then we'll conclude with talking about our biggest one yet, which is a housing project right downtown. Let's go to the next slide, John. This is the St. Albans house. It's where it all began. And in a moment of desperation, I met the current owner of this, developer who tried to put a deal together on this property for many years, and he had a gap that he just couldn't fill. I said, well, tell me about that gap. He said, it's about a 6-figure gap. It's the same conversation you were just talking about a minute ago, right? The city gave him $50,000. Said, fix up the outside of the building. We lent him $100,000 over 5 years at time value of money, 2%, 2.5%, something like that. No payments till the back end. So we shared the risk. As far as the bank was concerned, that $100,000 that we lent him was equity, so that helped them. It functioned like a loan, and it allowed him to fix up the outside of the building and then begin recruiting for tenants to fill the rest of it. He used all the state and federal historic tax credits, but many of those aren't enough. There's still a gap. This is what it looks like today. We got our $50,000 back. We got our $100,000 back plus interest. So that building was worth $50,000 at the time. Now it's on the grand list for $1.3 million. That's the heart of the premise right there. As municipalities, we can participate in the marketplace to reduce gaps and solve problems because we measure returns qualitatively and quantitatively and over a longer time horizon. That $50,000 that we invested in this project that's gone, that's the only piece that's gone, It's not really an investment, it's an expense. The $50,000 we gave to this project. That $1 million property is now in the city for how long? Maybe a century, right? Certainly many, many decades. And we can amortize that 50 over that whole time period. But you don't even need to have the cash on hand. You can walk down to the local bank and borrow that money and use the strength of your organization, because you have taxing authority, to pass those favorable terms on to the developer to do a project that you want. So that was deal number one. Next, we moved into creating a tax increment finance district. Tax increment financing, in brief, allows a community to issue bonds for public improvements. Public improvements for us are typically parking, brownfield cleanup, and streetscaping, but it can also be water and sewer. We have that, so we don't focus on that. With state approval, the tax revenues from the new development that comes in to respond to the public improvements that you've made can be used to pay off the debts on the public improvements that were necessary to attract that new development. So I'm going to tell you about a deal later on where we've got $10 million in new development. And we issued bonds for $2.5 million in public improvements to attract that new development. And that drives down the cost and allows the development to occur. And the revenues that pay off those bonds are paid for not by the existing taxpayers, but by the new taxpayer, the new entity. That's called the increment in tax increment financing. It is hands down the most transformative tool for economic development that I have ever seen. We started with this next project with a local hardware store that was ready to move out of town. I talked with the owner. I said, what's the deal? He said, I need more space. You don't have any space in the city. What are you willing to pay for land? $400,000. If I can find you a site in the city that's clean, will you pay $400,000 for it? He said yes. So we spent some time looking around at potential sites. Turned out that the owner of this site was having lunch at the next table. Ultimately, we walked to the bank and put together a deal to buy the land to relocate Ace Hardware. We borrowed $1 million from the bank using our tax anticipation note authority. Right now, interest rates for short-term borrowing are a little less than 1%. So you can borrow $1 million from the bank, short-term borrowing, for less than 10 grand a year. You can rent that $1 million for 10 grand a year. And that allows you to take advantage of opportunities that come up that may not come around again for 50 more years. So we bought the land. Our public improvements in Saint Albans and our tax increment financing plan are brownfield cleanup, streetscaping, and parking. So we cleaned the site, we sold it to the developer, the business owner, who put this on it. Next slide, please. I feel like I'm at the eye doctor, right? Back and forth. Which is better? So that's a no-brainer. There's a lot of public money in that, but we didn't raise anybody's taxes to pay for it. The community took risks, and we used all of our powers as a municipality. But we can do all of that and make great projects like this happen. Next slide. Next, we moved on to transforming this gem. Talk about a building that wasn't reaching its potential. This is one of the sites that became the heart of our downtown core project. We were approached by one of our largest employers, Mylan Pharmaceuticals, who said, look, I've got a plan to add 100 jobs, but I need more land to do so. We said, well, what would you like? And he said, well, I'd really like the state office building, which is right next to us. Could you help us with that? And he was being sort of facetious. And Shumlin was governor at the time. We put together a deal where the state of Vermont would sell their building to to Milan, who would expand, and they had 100 jobs. They paid twice market value for the existing state office building. And the state of Vermont came downtown and leased a brand new building that the REARC company built for them and leased back to the state of Vermont for 15 years. That created about $10 million in income that could be used to pay off the public improvements that we needed, 10 million in increment, excuse me, to pay off the public improvements that we needed in order to attract that building. So here's that site today. I believe that's on the tax rolls for 11 million presently. So in round numbers, that's what 10 or 11 million looks like.
What's in there?
250 state office workers. And formerly, they were just outside of downtown in another office building, which is now the Milan office building. Went from the SOB to the MOB. That plan that I referenced earlier from the 80s talked about lowering a hotel to downtown Saint Albans so that you didn't get one on the interstate sucking the lifeblood out of your downtown. And through some professional connections, we met some hotel developers who were interested if we could put together the right combination of incentives. And we were offering that hotel free land and deeded rights into 100 deeded rights into our city-owned parking garage. We would clean the land, of course, and give it to them as a blank slate. And that was the heart of our TIF application. We thought that deal had legs, but in the 11th hour, the hotel developer said, you know, we've been looking at the numbers, we'd really like to talk about some tax stabilization. And I told them, you know, sorry, we're in the increment business, we're not in the stabilization business. And so we went back out to bid and tested the marketplace. And now we got a whole new, since then our feasibility study had improved, we got a whole new raft of developers and contenders. But the market had changed a little bit. And so now we were able to get a new development team. Now we had an owner-operator who was interested. And they were willing to pay the taxes on it, which were about $200,000. But they were having trouble with the banks. And the hospitality industry was in a different place at that time, and so the equity requirements were getting quite steep. So rather than allow, you know, there's a saying in the real estate business, time kills all deals. And rather than allow that deal to languish on the vine, the city joined the project as an equity investor. So the city's an equity investor in the hotel, along with a Canadian investor and Jeff Davis of Peak CM Real Estate Development. So in that deal, we put up $1 million. The payback is, you know, after 5 years, based on the loan-to-value ratio and all of that. But we don't need the same return that a private investor does, right? Private investors need double-digit returns within 10 years. We need something that just recognizes the value of money. And that has tremendous value within a real estate development context. And our willingness to put up $1 million was the difference between a project that may or may not happen and a project that vaulted to the front of the line. So here it is today. Next slide. When people drive down through our communities, they evaluate the vitality of the community based on the public space and the private space. They don't say, "Oh, I really wish that property owner would take better care of his building and fill it with some tenants." Most of them say, "This town's really getting kind of run down. Somebody ought to do something about that." And that's the responsibility of our local governments. That's the entree into participating in the market, using market principles to accomplish the goals that are reflected in your policy and planning documents. Next slide, please. So that's the whole site, before the state office building, before the parking garage, and before the hotel. Stay there for a sec, John. Remember that commercial from the 80s? This is your brain on drugs. This is your brain on drugs. This is your community. Go to the next slide. This is your community on tax increment financing. TIF is the so-called the granddaddy of them all, the nuclear options, the most transformative. The legislature and the state agencies are protective of them. They're not easy to get, and you don't need one to get started. What I'm here today to encourage you to do is the principles are what's important. Participating in the marketplace, using the strength of your balance sheet to drive down costs and get development projects to happen today instead of decades from now. Next slide, please. One of the talking points out of Saint Albans is 7710. Some will have argued that tax increment financing is unnecessary, that development might not happen in Saint Albans, but it would happen elsewhere in the state of Vermont, and therefore the education fund would be better off if we didn't have to fund tax increment financing. Well, here's our experience. In the 7 years before we created our tax increment financing district, on average, we added $700,000 a year in non-residential property growth to our grand list. That's the little box on the left, that really cute little one. In the 7 years after the TIF, we have averaged $10 million per year. None of us can prove causation, but there's a heck of a lot of correlation. 10 million. We're 7 years in, we're on track, and the goal is to hit 100 million over 10 years, 10 million a year. And to do that, we'll have had to issue probably 25 or 26 million in public bonds to incent that private development. That's a decent return because that 25 million is paid off not with any of the existing taxpayers, but all the new development. And the whole state of Vermont gets to enjoy that 100 million through the statewide education fund. Next slide, please. So these are some of the lessons we've learned, and then I'm going to show you how we apply them to a housing project. The development our community envisions will require public investment. If you don't, you get what the market can provide. If somebody short-handed it for me on the ride down in the car, then you get a Dollar General. Public investment produces public control. You put skin in the game, you control the site, you control how it happens and when it happens. And our strengths, as municipality, have real value in a development context. Our access to capital, the return requirements, and how we measure risk. As I mentioned, the community vitality is evaluated by the public and the private. Our willingness to utilize our strengths can produce superior results in a shorter amount of time. And those returns are enjoyed for a very long time horizon, darn near the life of the city. Next slide, please. We've boiled it down to 3 principles. Economic development can be a municipal function. That's important. That puts it on par with a police department, with roads, with the fire department, with schools. And in my experience, when you talk to the voters and what they talk about that impacts their quality of life, those economic development issues are equally as important as all of those functions which are traditional municipal functions. Direct participation in the development process can make marginal projects viable. And as I mentioned, the return on investment is evaluated qualitatively and quantitatively. And these are the practices. Here's how you do it. In St. Albans, we like to buy the parcel, clean the parcel, and transfer the parcel for the desired use. When somebody comes into your office and says, I'd like to build 30 units of housing that meet this income requirement, do you know of a possible site? You're already behind the 8 ball. But if you've already bought that site, you're in the driver's seat. And you can play both defense to make sure that something that doesn't reflect your policy documents doesn't buy that land, and you can play offense. You can make the deal happen. You close financial gaps through equity contributions. We do rent guarantees on new projects. We do facade grants to make the building look how we want it to look. We pass money through in direct lending. And probably most important, we sweep. How many projects have you heard that died because a property owner wanted more money than the property was worth? It happens all the time. Only the municipality can step in and sweep away that property owner and amortize that delta, which is usually, several $100,000. Amortize it over decades. Because time kills all deals, and what's the cost of that property languishing for another 10 years? We also provide and manage the parking many times to encourage denser development and maximize the site. Parking is a core municipal function. If you provide it, you can sell it in the morning to a hotel and sell it in the evening to an office building and sell it in between to the people going to the restaurant. You like the airlines, right? But if they have to build it, it's only got one use, so you get fewer buildings, less density, and if you're in the tax increment financing business, less increment. And when you hit hurdles, you can scale it up. Let's go to the next slide. Big projects, like big tires, get over bumps easier. So after having accomplished all of the things I've just shown you, a parcel right across from my office was about to be foreclosed on. So there was one parcel comprised of, one foreclosure action comprised of this parcel, which used to house a 3-story mixed-use building, like they always used to build, and this, reflects contemporary, planning principles. This historic structure, small H, this building, and this office building. We didn't know who was going to show up at that foreclosure auction, and at this point we were roughly 15 million into the future of the city. We had a compelling interest into who buys that property. So there's a unique time to buy a property right before foreclosure, when the person who still owns it is worn out by the bank and ready to cut a deal. And the bank has an interest in our case, they have an interest not just in recovering their funds invested, but they have a shared interest in the future of the city. So on the eve before the foreclosure auction, we cut a 3-party deal between the property owner who was about to lose it and the bank who was about to acquire it. We picked it up for $500,000. And not surprisingly, pretty quickly, folks started saying, bring back that building. We want another 3-story building. We want another mixed-use building. And so, pretty quickly we got to, that's great, where are they going to park? In the back is a 3-story housing building with about 30 units in it. Let's go to the next one. This was a real dumb. We was on the grand list for 750, 800,000, and properties like this are tough to grapple with because from a housing security perspective, it's cheap housing that people need. But it wasn't really reaching its potential. And the person who owned it hadn't been making a lot of reinvestments in the property. But we were going to need to pick that up in order to do something. So we began to put together a vision. John, let's go to the next one. That looks something like this. So here's Main Street. The City Hall's right here. And the lots that we acquired in the initial one are 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, in order to do something here, you could just buy this, right? And then put a whole bunch of surface parking here, and your office building on the front, your mixed-use building would probably happen. But you're leaving a lot of opportunity on the table. So what we decided to do was instead build 60 units of housing on the back of the lot here, replace the 30 that were existing and add, I believe, 33 more, and have shared parking underneath this building, and in between. There was a question earlier about threading the needle on historic preservation. We bought this red building here, which the city did decide to save, work that out with historic preservation, but the rest of the buildings were demolished. And the vision we had was if we could put together the right package of incentives, maybe we could get our affordable housing developer, which is Champlain Housing Trust in our region, to replace the 30 units that were there. And maybe we could also do some workforce housing on the remainder of the site. So our vision looks something like this. Maybe that could be the affordable housing building. Next slide. And maybe that could be the workforce housing. Next slide. And maybe that could be the office building on the front. And it happened. But it only happened because the city owned the land, and the city drove the development costs down. We closed the gap by taking on the project killers: brownfield cleanup and structured parking. So today we've got 25,000 square feet of office space on Main Street. The top is leased to Northwestern Medical Center, who runs a nurse training program in partnership with Vermont Technical College. The second floor is leased to the Community College of Vermont, and the city has figured out a way to subsidize that. The first floor is retail space. The city's backstopped the rents, and our exposure there is about $60,000 a year, which is manageable. The problem is we envision it for restaurants, and nobody can find anybody to work in a restaurant these days. So the core of the deal is solid. Next slide, please. This is the Champlain Housing Trust building. Just wanted to give a shout out for those guys. You know, we work with a lot of nonprofits and a lot of partners, but CHT was a joy to work with and went far beyond what was reasonable. So that's their new building. Next slide. There's the workforce housing market rate units. There's 33, I believe, units there. 20 are deed restricted, and the balance, I believe, are market rate. I might be wrong. We need a direction with the digit there, but the concept holds. And then here's another shot of Main Street. So this works. We've spent we've spent 23 million to date. We've got 70 million in new tax revenues. We've got 60 units of new housing, and we've never raised anybody's taxes to pay for it. The voters have a chance to approve everything when it goes to them in the bond votes, but we don't ask them for permission before we act in order to preserve our interest and our opportunity in real estate deal. You can always back out of something, but you need the ability to, at the very least, get a property under contract. Next slide, please, Jim. I know that there's several deal junkies in the room who want to know the specifics on the Congressman Deal. So the city acquired, cleaned, and transferred the land, and we agreed to build and operate the parking, which serves all 3 buildings. We contributed in round numbers about $5 million for land acquisition, cleanup, and parking construction. And in return, we got 25,000 square feet of commercial space and 63 units of combined housing. Our tax base has increased by $10 million, and we got the new housing. And that's a pretty common ratio. It costs us usually about $2.5 million in TIF to create $10 million in tax base in increment. And usually that TIF funding isn't enough. It needs to be supplemented by usually an equal or proportional amount of other grant sources. So 2.5 in city bonds, another 2.5 in other sources. And that's how you grow your tax base. That's how you get $10 million. We've done that in broad strokes every year for 7 years. And that's a win-win for everybody in the state of Vermont because we all share those revenues through the statewide property tax. Next slide. Let me wrap it up and I'll take a couple of questions. Municipalities can lead their redevelopment by participating in the marketplace. That's a radical thought right there, right? That part of running a town isn't just dealing with the police union and managing the personnel issues, but looking towards the future and creating your community of tomorrow. We can take risks and absorb costs that others cannot. The developers and builders in the room that will tell you the most risky part of a project is getting out of the ground. We can get you out of the ground. And then they can do what they do best, which is come in and build the units at the cost you want for the market that you're trying to hit. We currently have a confluence of historically low interest rates. ARPA funds, both direct to our communities and indirect through the state agencies, and infrastructure spending opportunities. That's diminished a little bit by the high construction costs, and that's real. Costs are, it's not uncommon to see costs be double. But I think the amount of money flowing around presently, particularly if you think of what it's going to be like decades from now when we have to figure out how to balance the other side of the equation, creates an unparalleled opportunity to step up to the plate and take a swing at some great projects. It's never going to be cheaper to do this project than it is today. So I would open it up for any questions.
I have a quick question. So Saint Albans has a serious optics problem with their diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I would like to know what you guys are doing about that issue.
Sure. Thanks for the question. We're at 2 weeks ago or so, we created a belonging, equity, and inclusion committee. If you email me, I'm happy to send you the draft documents about that committee. We're currently recruiting for it. The city has, one of the earlier speakers talked about the phrase, all are welcome here. The city has created a marketing campaign around that phrase. And so when you drive into Saint Albans, that the banners no longer say welcome, they say all are welcome here. And one of the reasons that's important is I think it's important for the community in these times to be clear about where they stand and what the values of the community are. And also to fight speech with speech. We've had some problems with offensive stickers showing up. And so if somebody wanted to cover up that sticker with a sticker that was more in line with our city values, I wouldn't stop them from doing so. We had a lot of road leafleting on city stoplights and that type of thing. Personally, I'm on the League of Cities and Towns Equity Committee. A lot of the DEI issues emanate out of the police department. There's a police advisory committee whose charge is to help ensure the implementation of the transformation roadmap for implementing 21st century policing, which is on our website. You can email me and have you send me a copy of that as well. So that's what we're up to, and we're open to new ideas.
Hi, I'm Jenny Hislop from the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. I'm one of the funders of these last two projects that you talked about. And we spent some time this morning talking about qualities of a successful project that could be successfully funded by agencies like ours. And so I saw this project on the agenda yesterday, and I asked my staff, why was it so successful? What were the qualities that made this deal able to be funded? And I just wanted to share some of their comments with the group. They said smart growth and location was really key. They said the city's willingness to commit to infrastructure, to meeting the infrastructure needs was really important. They said that you as a city manager being willing to take risks, both financial and political, for the greater good in the community was absolutely imperative. That there were so many pieces that needed to come together, including the TIF district, but that you approached it with faith and confidence, even when you couldn't guarantee the outcome from the outset. So I just wanted to share that with folks for context.
Well, thanks. We're not taking any more, Seth. We're going out on that, right?
We have time for another question. What, Bill?
What was your policy on keeping rents stabilized with your involvement on those 66 units?
They're deed restricted, so it's the VHCB policy, and there's a slight uptick. I mean, both of them have the affordable housing, so-called units done by the nonprofit developer, has one restriction, and then there's a slight uptick, I believe, for the workforce housing units next door. They're all, functionally within striking distance of 80 to 120% median. We're in the Chittenden County MSA. So anybody know what's that?
Jenny, use the mic. Yeah, thanks.
There was a housing revenue bond that was used to fund this through VHCD, and it allowed for higher income restrictions and higher rent restrictions than is typical. It allowed some of the units to be up to 120% instead of our normal 80 to 100. So it's a little more flexible than what we would typically fund at now.
So how do you determine your base rates?
The rates are based on what would be affordable, assuming 30% of area median income. So if the units are targeted to people at 100% of area median income, we'd look at affordability slightly below that, so maybe 30% and 80% of area median income. But it's really kind of a case-by-case basis, and we work with the developer to draft those.
Is the housing, though, controlled by a private developer versus a nonprofit development group?
One is nonprofit, one is private, but VHCB, I believe, holds the covenant on both sides.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.